Colleagues, thank you so much for the opportunity. And I told JP this morning, this is what happens when you miss one of the planning meetings. You slot it in the last one for the day. So I'll try to keep it as short as possible. Antoinette and JP has mentioned the different structures at Stellenbosch University, the way in which we started to organize the different functions, and specifically also then reflecting on the particular project which we call the RTAP project, Renewal of Target Academic Programs, and this is what this presentation is all about. What I'm doing is, or what I'm trying to do, is to reflect on the dichotomies, the tensions that we experience within such a project from an operational side, but equally also then looking from a theory and from a scholarly perspective when we start to implement such approaches. So what I'm going to start off with is just very briefly to outline our core outcomes that we had when we started to implement the project at the university. And then the second part of the presentation is where I'll share with you some of my thoughts in terms of looking at it in a scholarly way and trying to interrogate more of these questions as we move through the project. As we know by now, Antoinette has mentioned this morning as well, we're very fortunate that we received funding from Council. We appointed what we call, perhaps due to a lack of a better word, we used the term blended learning coordinators in the different faculties, and you've recognized many of the faces within the audience as well today. The purpose of the appointment of these staff, it's actually twofold. It was mainly to assist more at a strategic level in terms of implementing and starting to use learning technologies within the curriculum, and therefore we believe that it's necessary that these staff are line managed by the Vice Dean Teaching and Learning. But equally also on the other side is that their functions are very similar to very of the so-called academic development functions that we have in faculty. So they're engaged in aspects such as training, academic development, one-to-one support, and then obviously also some of these colleagues are interested in the scholarship of teaching and learning. So that was our first outcome, is to start to at least ensure that we have one person in a faculty that could assist in this whole process. Of course, our second focus then was to how to support these colleagues within the different faculties. And this is rooted actually on three pillars. The one Antoinette mentioned this morning, we have what we call quarterly blended learning meetings, BLC meetings. And the purpose of these meetings are twofold. It's administrative of nature. And because we engage in a decentralized model, so each of these colleagues are situated within a faculty on their own. So they've got their own office there, they've got their line manager, and 20% of their time is allocated to our center. And therefore for us, these quarterly meetings are really important from an administrative side, but equally also it's an opportunity of sharing of practice. It's a time where we share what is happening in the faculties and where we learn from each other. Another aspect for us was obviously the continuous professional development of these colleagues. And initially, we started with a very much a targeted approach in terms of this. So in terms of, Antoinette mentioned this morning, the blended learning short course that we have at the university, we expected of these colleagues to at least attend that short course and once again experience it from a student perspective. Our short course is in a blended mode of delivery. But equally also, as time progresses, we started to realize that, of course, and that's very typical to our field, is we experience the tensions between technical skills, teaching and learning expertise, and then also, obviously also the scholarship of teaching and learning. And therefore, we decided to actually get to the point where we encourage context-specific continuous professional opportunities. So therefore, for the last 2 years, colleagues could actually identify training or development opportunities that's suitable towards and working towards their own context and their own work in the faculties. And then lastly, what we also found, which was actually quite a surprise to us, and that had nothing to do with our center side, was that organically a community of practice started to develop between these colleagues. A journal club developed and colleagues started to engage in an informal way to start to engage in aspects such as the scholarship of teaching and learning. So that was our second outcome that we focused on. Clearly, with as you've heard, the funding that we received for us, and this is one of the contentious points that I would like to share, is that of course we need to monitor, of course we need to evaluate and to ensure quality with a project with such a large extent and potential impact. But if you look at the quote that I share there of Fung, he rightly mentions, we will always experience and debate the tensions between quality management approaches and academic freedom. And that is the nature of the beast in the work that we engage with as well, specifically in this project as well. We did employ the services of an external company to help us to actually do an outcomes evaluation from the start of the implementation of the project. And for us, that's really useful. On an annual basis, they actually provided us with feedback, and we would try it where sensible and appropriate. We actually tried to address those issues as it came along. Our fourth and last outcome that we really believe is important is obviously to report on what is happening in the faculties. Of course, we need to formally report, as has been mentioned at several occasions, and we do that on a regular basis. But equally for us, even more important, is to celebrate and to share the work of academics in the faculties. And for us, we decided to do it at two different levels. The first one, and Magda and Ilse, both of them are sitting here in the audience and played incredibly important roles in this, was firstly to develop what we call case study booklets. And we developed that for each year. So each faculty had to come up with at least one case study that they could share the practices and the work that academics were engaging with in the different faculties. And these resources are incidentally also available on our website for you to view if you're interested. So for us, that's building a continuous resource and also learning from each other what's happening in the different faculties. And that's the case study booklets. In terms of, and you won't be able to see it in detail now, but in terms of the online resources that we started to develop, for us it was really important, and it's been mentioned here today as well, is not to foreground the technologies. So for us, we were guided by educational challenges within the different faculties. But what we wanted to do is to make it as authentic as possible. So educational challenges were identified by means of work in the faculties, and then what we tried to do is to encourage academics to approach those challenges by means of the aid of technologies. And what the format that we then follow in terms of our online resource development is actually to start with we scaffold it. So we start with the educational challenge. Authentically, we try to then have a video clip of an academic sharing their ideas and their experiences by using a particular tool or approach. And only then we get to the point that we start to unpack the affordances of that particular tool. And then lastly, we get to the user guide on how to use that guide. So for us, that in our center and in our approaches in the faculty, this is something that we really believe is a way of working towards starting to use technologies, but engaging academics by means of looking at the educational challenges that they face on a regular basis. So that's the operational side, the implementation side of the project. For me, I actually started to become interested also in the events and the mechanisms and the structures as they exist in this complex whole. And in this case, specifically then what I call technology-enhanced curriculum development. When structural mechanisms are activated, they produce certain effects, and these particular mechanisms can provide completely different actions at different times and have different causes. And therefore, the aim of 4 studies that I'm involved in at the moment is to actually reach beyond the purely empirical assertions of this specific phenomenon and to start to describe what was in the object that made it actually possible. Of course, I argue that we cannot just be satisfied that A is generally followed by B. And we must start to engage with what the critical realists call transfactual questions. We must look beyond the factual events as well, and we need to start to identify these generative mechanisms which influence the work that we're busy with, in a sense. So what I'm trying to do and what is the 4 questions that I was particularly interested in and still busy with are the following. The first study that I'm busy with at the moment is to actually look at, and it is closely aligned obviously with the project itself, but what are the factors at play when academics decide to engage or not engage with educational technologies in the curriculum, specifically focusing on curriculum development. Why do they decide to use it or not to use it? And I'll unpack these studies a bit later on in the slides. The second study is also still focusing on academics, and it's perhaps a bit more abstract one, but for me it was important to find out what is the meaning that academics make if we refer to the notion of curriculum development. Not about the process, not about the steps we need to follow, moving back. What do we understand if we talk and we refer to the notion of curriculum development? The third and the fourth questions actually speak to the role of academic developers, or then in our case what we call blended learning coordinators within the faculties. And for me what is really important, JP has mentioned it earlier on as well, and some of the other colleagues, Tiana as well, the whole issue of an ethics of care. And we very often relate to that in terms of academics. But my argument that I'm making also is, what about the academic developer? The person sitting straight in the middle of this whole process. It's a change process. It's a top-down approach very often. You have the impact, or you have the conversations with academics. And then to complicate matters even more is the fact that you need to add technology into the mix as well. So in terms of just thinking about a normative framework to support and care for academic developers involved in this specific process is for me quite interesting, and that's what the third study is all about. And then the concluding study is still focusing on the role of academic developers, or then blended learning coordinators in this case. And for me what's really interesting is start to unpack what are the particular knowledge practices that they valorize within the different faculties. In other words, getting to the point to see about what are the actual things that they engage with in a faculty when it's expected of them to assist in curriculum development within a technology-enhanced mode. The way in which I approach it, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, is that I've employed methodological pluralism. Of course, if it's under the umbrella of critical realism. Critical realism has aspects of compatibility with interpretivism, where it argues for the sense-making of actors engaged in a particular phenomenon. And therefore, 2 of the studies I employed interpretive phenomenological analysis, and 2 other studies I employed, and some of the colleagues alluded you to that, legitimation code theory, LCT, for studies 2 and for studies 4. For me, the motivation of thinking of methodological pluralism is not purely only a philosophical or theoretical reason, but it's also, in a sense, for our field, educational technology field, to really evolve and to grow. We need to start to interrogate theoretical and methodological underpinnings. And also it speaks to that whole notion of knowledge blindness that Mayton mentions, that we need to interrogate not only knowledge or knowers, but move beyond that. So very briefly, just referring to the 4 studies. We don't have time, obviously, to go into depth and detail here. In terms of the first study, what I found was in terms of the reasons why academics decide to engage and not engage with learning technologies, is actually, it's the interplay between 3 broad factors. The institution plays a very effective or a very important role there. The whole notion of knowledge, which we very often underplay, is also very, very evident here. And then for me, which was actually in a sense also a type of an eye-opener, and it comes back to what we spoke about, the human aspects, the individual differences of colleagues. Very often we get to the point that in terms of the institution, what came out of the study was that very often colleagues communicated to me that expectations aren't as clear as they wish it could be. And if we think practically about it from an academic's perspective, to design a fully online course is one thing. To expect them to design a blended course is something completely different. How much do I blend? How far do I need to go with that? Is it one tool, two tools? How does that approach work? And if there's and our easy question is always be guided by the educational outcomes. But that's very vague. So how do we go about in that process? For me, in terms of knowledge, colleagues also there mentioned, and that for me was quite a surprise, very little in reference to technical support or technological skills. It's pedagogical knowledge that they're interested in. And it comes back to, Janet, what you said there. The question is, how do we, and in the literature they speak about the whole notion of transformative pedagogies. How do we go about in that? How do we start to unpack that? What does it mean, actually? If it's not supposed to be substituted or replicated, what then else is it? And how do we start that conversations with academics? And then for me also really interesting from an individual difference perspective, it came out there that many colleagues told me that I'm just really not interested in technology. How do we deal with that? How do we deal with that within a faculty context and within a departmental context? If that's really not my disposition, it's not part of my level of interest, how do we get people to really engage and buy into such a process? So that's the one study. The second study was looking at the way in which different faculties make sense of that whole notion of curriculum development. I only use 5 academics within each faculty, and therefore, obviously, it's a very broad perspective that I'm giving here. Ideally, one would need to get to the point that you actually start to interrogate at different departments and start to look, and obviously have conversations with more colleagues. But for me, it's a starting point to start to look at the way in which people think differently about the notion of curriculum development. In this case, and we don't have time to actually explain to you the different quadrants, but just very briefly, the 5 faculties that we have here, your top right-hand side, you've got what we call a rhizomatic code, and obviously you won't have the background on it now, but it actually means that when people speak about and make meaning of the notion of curriculum development, they use high levels of abstraction, and it's very context independent. And in terms of these 5 faculties, you'll see that all of them are fairly strong in that quadrant, but especially education and theology were the 2 faculties that had very strong preferences within that quadrant. And that's what we call an example of a code match. So there are resemblances in terms of the way in which they understand it. However, on the other side, there are also examples of code clashes. And one example that I can give there, for instance, is on your top left-hand corner, is what we call the Rarified Code. And that's where we refer to simplified meanings which are context independent. So the way in which they explain the notion of curriculum development is in a simplified manner, and it's also context independent. It's not speaking towards their discipline specifically. And there what I picked up there specifically is, especially EMS and health, it's clearly there that there's a higher preference there than some of the other faculties. So obviously the idea is that we would need to start to interrogate that. For me, the take-home message of this study is simply that when we start to develop tailor-made programs, or when we start to develop a faculty-based program, are we really knowing what these colleagues bring to that process? Shouldn't we step back and start to interrogate these meaning-making aspects first and foremost, and then move forward towards the processes to get to the point or what we actually aim to achieve? That's a second study, nearing the end, Tiana. I see you have the number there ready for me. I know you want to go home as well. The third last slide is focusing on that whole notion of the ethics of care. And for me, this is really important. And the normative framework that I want to suggest speaks to the institutional responsibilities as well as the notion of care and how we define care, specifically for academic developers. How does that support network work? How do we act responsively towards those specific care needs as well? The level of responsibilities from the institutional side, the manner by which we actually start to manage the knowledge within such a framework as well. We don't have much more time to talk about that, but if you're interested, we can chat about that later on this evening. In terms of the last study, for me, I'm really interested in this whole notion that all of us talk about the whole notion we're moving forward. There's no going back. Technology is here to stay, etc., etc. And those are debates on their own for their own time. But for me, what is really important is trying to identify what are the practices that these colleagues in the faculties valorize. What are the practices that they believe is essential to be able to work in such a context? And that, once again, speaks to LCT. You'll see that I refer to epistemic relations, which is actually speaking to the whole notion of what is perceived as legitimate knowledge. And then the social relations on your right-hand side speaks to the knowers, the people who are responsible for knowing, those attributes that they should display. And if you look at your left-hand side, some of the epistemic relations speak to the whole notion of knowledge of change management, the way in which we should approach change management, the whole idea of educational expertise, which is not a surprise. For me, which is interesting here, is knowledge about information technology, ICTs. Very often we try to separate these roles in terms of we've got the IT people and we've got the academic developers. And what I want to argue is that isn't it perhaps time that we need to start to mind the gap and start to think of a way of starting to merge these different roles? Because inevitably, can we really argue that we can move forward if we don't have a working understanding and knowledge of ICTs if we want to engage with academics within the area of curriculum development? And then right on cue, my last slide is what's the way forward? Asking transfactual questions are often uncomfortable. They are thought provocative, and of course they are debatable. But for a field to evolve and grow theoretically and methodologically, we certainly should celebrate accomplishments and triumphs, which I hope we share today as well, but equally not to hesitate to engage with deeper rooted issues, structures and mechanisms. Thank you so much.